Welcome back to The Explainer. I am genuinely thrilled to have you here today because we're unpacking something that is, well, it's highly specific and, frankly, a wildly unconventional sociological document. Our goal today is to objectively map out a theory presented in a text titled Whites Are Not One Race Theory. It essentially attempts to categorize modern white populations into two distinct ancient biblical lineages. Now, to be clear, we're just here to examine the author's framework, purely to understand how these types of fringe arguments are structured and argued. So let's just jump right in. We've got a very clear roadmap to get through this today. We'll start with the two ancient lineages, move into contrasting physical traits, then look at alleged behavioral differences, trace some historical migration patterns, and wrap up with contradictory modern stereotypes. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the two ancient lineages. Okay, so here is the absolute core framework of the text. It proposes that modern white populations actually descend from two completely distinct, historically opposed biblical lineages. Specifically, we're talking about the Israelites and the Canaanites. And according to this document, these ancient groups didn't just fade away into the history books. Nope. The author claims they migrated widely, and their descendants are walking around today, continuing to exhibit very specific, observable physical and behavioral traits. So the whole foundation of this text relies on taking modern people and dropping them into these ancient biblical buckets. Which brings us right into Section 2, contrasting physical traits. The author draws a super strict physical line in the sand here. On one side of the ledger, you have what the text calls white Israelites. They're described as well-built, muscular, proportionate. We're talking strong facial features, robust jaws, and notably having darker or ruddy skin tones. Then, in direct contrast, it describes white Canaanites as generally thinner, more gracile. It claims they have less muscle tone regardless of their actual weight, more delicate features, curly or frizzy hair, and skin tones that can swing wildly from extremely pale all the way to swarthy. It is an incredibly rigid physical categorization system. And you might be wondering, how does the author justify these specific physical claims? Well, they go straight to ancient texts. The document actually states David is described as ruddy, and Adam's name itself carries the meaning red. So the author is literally using these specific biblical translations to argue why the Israelite lineage supposedly carries those darker, ruddy skin tones all the way into the modern era. Moving right along to Section 3, alleged behavioral differences. Now, this is where the claims get incredibly, wildly specific. The source juxtaposes some heavily contrasting behavioral tendencies. It claims white Israelites are naturally leadership-oriented, adventurous, disciplined, and industrious. The text even points out modern habits like enjoying outdoor jogging and structured workouts at gyms. It paints this picture of total physical discipline. Conversely, it claims white Canaanites are specialist-oriented, shrewd, operating with a scarcity mindset. It says they're naturally subversive and prone to indulging in internet subcultures. It actually specifically calls out platforms like Reddit. I mean, it is fascinating how the author attempts to tie thousands of years old ancient lineages to highly specific modern internet browsing habits. And this dichotomy extends deeply into psychology too. If we look at mindset, the text assigns a leadership and enterprising nature to the Israelites, but a specialist scarcity mindset to the Canaanites. Looking at disposition, Israelites are described as disciplined and socially organized, whereas the Canaanites are painted as subversive and ideologically extreme. And finally, under vices or habits, the text links the Israelite lineage broadly to just positive historical stereotypes, but links the Canaanite lineage to things like sexual immorality, pornography addiction, and retreating into online echo chambers. It is a sweeping, absolute division of human behavior. All right, let's shift gears to Section 4, historical migration patterns. So, where did everyone supposedly go? The text proposes a very literal geographic map of history. It states that Israelites migrated northwest and east, heavily populating places like Scotland and northwestern Europe. It even makes the massive claim that this lineage totally dominated pre-French Revolution France. On the flip side, the Canaanites were supposedly less scattered, remaining heavily concentrated down in the Mediterranean, so Italy, Spain, and Greece. The author even goes as far as to claim this Canaanite lineage influenced the Italian black nobility and rose to massive prominence in post-revolution France. The text literally tries to tie massive demographic and political shifts in European history directly back to the movements of these two ancient groups. And to anchor this Mediterranean stronghold for the Canaanite lineage, the source once again relies on the Bible. It quotes, "The account of the Canaanite woman Jesus met, a Syrophoenician from the region of modern-day Greece, further reinforces the Mediterranean stronghold." The author is actively using this one specific piece of biblical geography to validate their entire modern mapping of southern Europe as a Canaanite hub. Now, the text does acknowledge reality here for a second. Centuries of migration, travel, and intermarriage, especially in melting pots like America, have caused significant overlap between these groups. But the author asserts that surnames still offer a reliable shortcut for identifying these lineages today. According to the document, Northwestern European surnames are more frequently carried by those with white Israelite ancestry, while Italian or Southern European surnames are more likely to indicate white Canaanite ancestry. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Contradictory Modern Stereotypes. Everything we've covered today really builds to this single, crucial question that the author is trying to answer. How exactly does this ancient biblical dichotomy explain the wildly contradictory modern stereotypes we see within the exact same racial group today? Let's see how the author attempts to explain it. The author clinically breaks this down by attributing wildly opposing modern archetypes directly back to this proposed ancient genetic mix. On one hand, you have what the text calls the Nordic ideal, the stereotype of someone who is strong, disciplined, enterprising, and physically imposing. The author asserts this is just a direct manifestation of the Israelite lineage. On the other hand, you have the socially awkward archetype, which the text harshly describes as creepy, socially deviant, mass shooters, or internet subculture addicts. The author aligns this entirely with the Canaanite lineage. The document essentially argues that these intensely opposing archetypes exist side by side today precisely because of the intermingling of these two very specific ancient groups over millennia. Furthermore, the author draws a pretty dramatic conclusion from all of this. They claim that the historical enmity between ancient Israel and Canaan didn't just stay in the past. It allegedly continues to this very day. The text states that this ancient opposition manifests as subtle friction in our modern social, political, and cultural arenas. Basically, according to this document, the natural rivalry between these two groups is the hidden engine driving our collective behaviors, our societal trends, and even our personal day-to-day interactions right now. Which leaves us with this final overarching thought based on the document we've just unpacked together. Do these ancient, historically opposed lineages truly account for the extreme physical, behavioral, and cultural diversity seen in modern white populations today? It's an incredibly unconventional framework that attempts to explain a massive scale of human behavior through a very narrow, highly specific historical lens. It absolutely gives you a totally different perspective on how some people try to categorize the complex world around them. Thank you so much for joining me as we mapped out this unique source material today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.